everybody, welcome back to Glaciers and Glacial Geomorphology. We're in the section of the module now where we're transitioning from the glaciology part of what we've been talking about, the characteristics and behaviour of glaciers, into the geomorphology section where we're focusing more specifically on the landforms, the landscapes and the glacial processes that create and modify those landforms and landscapes. So we're coming into the bit of the module now where we're going to be talking about eskers and drumlins and erosion and deposition and tunnel valleys and selective linear erosion. So I know a lot of people get into glaciology, especially from the geography side, because of an interest in the fantastic landscapes that glaciers can create. Well, that's the section of the module that we're moving into over these next few sessions. So this video is a short introduction to glacial geomorphology. Glacial geomorphology is all about the geomorphic processes, the landforms and the landscapes that are associated with glaciers. So we're going to be talking in this session about glaciological conditions or a glaciological setting, a glaciological process environment within which specific glacial processes occur that create glacial landforms, and we're going to be talking about the assemblages of those landforms that go together to make up a glacial or glaciated landscape. So we're going to be talking about erosional processes and landforms and landscapes, we're going to be talking about depositional processes, landforms and landscapes, and we're going to be talking about composite sets of processes where erosion and deposition happen at the same time at the same place, and we get complex composite landforms and landscapes resulting from these complex process environments and these complex process assemblages. One of the key points that I want to make is that the geography of glacial landforms and landscapes, the geography of geomorphology if you like, is very specific. There is a particular geography that we can pick out in landforms that relates to a particular geography that we can see in the processes going on, which itself relates to a particular geography that we can see in the glaciological conditions. So the geography of glaciers and the geography of processes within glaciers, that drives the geography of landforms and landscapes in glacial environments. The second key point is that we're talking about a time transgressive system. In other words, what's going on in a glacier changes through time and the geographies change through time. So at one point in time we might have a glacier bed here, a glacier margin here and a proglacial environment there, and we can associate specific processes and specific landforms with each of those different process environments, each in their own particular location. But at a different point in time, the glacier might advance or retreat, and so a location that was previously subglacial might now become proglacial, or a proglacial or ice marginal landscape might now become subglacial. So we build up sequences over time of histories of different process environments, and those different process environments are each associated with different types of erosional or depositional or composite landform and landscape types. So we build up a history of landscape evolution mirroring the history of glacier changes. So there are lots of interesting and complex things to think about when we're talking about glacial geomorphology, glacial landforms and landscapes, and that's what we're going to be talking about over the next few sessions of this module. So in glacial geomorphology we're interested in the environmental conditions, and in this context of glacial geomorphology we're talking about the glacial or glaciological process environment if you like. So we have a glaciological process environment in which the glacial setting leads to a certain set or assemblage of geomorphic processes, some different combinations of erosion, transport, deposition, specific mechanisms of each of those different processes. So that's our process environment, glacial process environment. Those processes then lead to the development of landforms and landscapes, assemblages of landforms, which are distinctively glacial distinctly glacial in nature because they're derived from that glaciological process environment. So a glacial process environment gives us a set of glacial landforms and landscapes. So that's what geomorphology is all about, the process environment giving us an associated set of landforms and landscapes that change over time, partly in response to changes in that environment. Glacial geomorphology is that in a glacial context, so glacial landforms and landscapes deriving from a glacial process environment. Now, because the landforms and landscapes that we can see all around us are derived from that environment, we can also work backwards up this page, if you like, and as well as identifying this kind of diagnostic set of characteristics, or this predictive set of characteristics, where we say, well, because the glacier is like this, therefore these processes are going to be happening under that glacier. It's a warm-based glacier, it's a cold-based glacier, it's a surging glacier, therefore, because of the water availability or the basal water pressure, all these glaciological parameters, because of all of those, we're ending up with these particular processes happening. And look, because we have these particular processes happening, that's why we're going to end up with these particular landforms and landscapes. We can work down our diagram, if you like, in that direction, seeing how one thing leads to another. But we can invert that, and we sometimes refer to this as geomorphological inversion modelling, and we can work the other way up our diagram like detectives, saying, well, here we have the evidence in the landscape around us, and we can read that evidence of this shape of valley, or that shape of rock, this shape of landform. And from the evidence left behind in the landscape, we can say, well, given that these kinds of environments and processes lead to these kinds of landforms and landscapes, here are the landforms and landscapes that we've got. Well, that must mean that these different processes have been operating in this environment to give us these landforms and landscapes. And if those processes were operating, well, then we must have been in this kind of environment, because you wouldn't have had glacier sliding, you wouldn't have had this kind of erosion, you wouldn't have had these kinds of processes going on if the glacier was this cold, or if the glacier was this temperate, or if you did have water, if you didn't have water. So we can figure things out about this glacial environment, even tens of thousands of years after it's disappeared, by looking at the landforms and landscapes that it's left behind. And that's what we're kind of doing in this geomorphology section. We're taking our knowledge and understanding of glaciers, glacier characteristics and glacier behaviour. We're looking now at how that connects to the landforms and landscapes that glaciers leave behind, and we're looking both to see that direct connection, if you like, between the nature of the environment and the landforms that we can find, and then we're looking to read those landforms to reconstruct or recreate the glacial process environments and the characteristics of the glaciers that must have been there to give us these landforms. And that's what geomorphology, well, that's one of the things that makes geomorphology interesting, our ability to go both down that diagram and then up again the other side. And that's what we'll be doing in the next few lectures. And we can do all of that at a variety of different scales. If the weather warms up later, we can go out and have a look at the grand landscape around where I'm sat now, where there are moraines and ancient glacial lake beds and shorelines, and we can see the big landscapes left behind by former glaciers. Or you can just go out into the garden here and pull up a pebble out of the ground and find these faceted, striated and sub-rounded morphologies that tell us that this rock was brought here by a glacier. The rock is an erratic, this isn't the kind of geology, this isn't the kind of lithology that you'd expect from my local bedrock. This has been brought here from somewhere else. The morphology, the shape of this chunk of rock, tells us that it was brought here by a glacier. The faceting, the sub-rounded morphology and the striations on it. Those are distinctive characteristics of glacial transport underneath a glacier. So at all sorts of different scales we can apply this idea of processes driven by environmental characteristics, or the characteristics of a glacier environment deciding what processes are going on, those processes affecting landforms, rocks, and us then saying, well, look at this, that landform, that morphology, that evidence tells us something about what the glacier must have been like. So I'll put together some neater slides of what I was drawing on the whiteboard, and we'll go through in a little bit more detail with some specific examples how you can pull out some of the ideas about this connection between the environment, the glaciological controls and the geomorphological outcome.